NFL draft time is an exciting time of the year for NFL fans. It means hope. Hope that your team can pick up some better players in positions that they might be lacking. But how do you get into the NFL draft? Well, you might start by reading mock drafts, so that is ratings of players by so-called experts. But one of the problems is there's just all these mock drafts, and who's going to aggregate these mock drafts and filter out by positions you might be interested in? Maybe you want to do some analysis on mock drafts yourself. Well, thankfully, Benjamin has a website up. He has built a Shiny app where he does all that. So why don't you head on over to his site, it's in the show notes, listen to the episodes, and play around with his Shiny dashboards.
Running a podcast costs money. Chilling with Charlie is proudly sponsored by Betfair Australia. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. They are not a bookmaker, and you can see how they champion data modelling by checking out bit.ly/BetfairCharlie. Gamble responsibly.
Well, thank you for joining me on another episode of Chilling with Charlie, Ben. I guess to start things off with, why don't you just tell everyone about yourself, your background, and what got you so interested in the NFL mock drafts?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. So a little bit about me. So, I live in Washington, D.C. I don't necessarily have a background in traditional data science. My background is more in kind of applied economics. But, in college, I had an awakening around data and how you can use data to, kind of find out what's going on in the world beyond the things that we can see with our eyes. So got really interested in data, did some undergraduate research in public policy and economics around kind of the impact of environmental change on real estate prices in Pittsburgh, because I went to college at the University of Pittsburgh down the block from Carnegie Mellon. From there, I got a master's degree in public policy from the University of Southern California. So my career has been, mostly in my interests have been around data and public policy. I got into sports when kind of this project has kind of been going on for the past couple years. One of my best friends from college, we would watch the draft together, and we would be just like, millions of other people. And we'd see a pick happen, a team would make a selection, and we'd say, that seems high, or, hey, that seems really low. I didn't necessarily know what that meant. And so I thought, this is a really great opportunity to get a quantitative perspective on the draft. And so, I thought, there's somebody out there who's probably done something in this area, the mock draft aggregation, or just kind of trying to find some signal in the noise of all these mock drafts. And mock drafts are all over the place. So I looked around and really no one had done anything on it. And so it's kind of one of those times where, you normally have an idea and research, and first thing you do is you do a search and see if anyone's done work on it. And there has been research done on the draft, but not necessarily trying to predict the outcome of the draft. There's been a lot of kind of correlational work around, does athletic testing have anything to do with actual draft selection? And some element of which mock drafters are good at making mock draft predictions. But, I think that one of the things that we've learned from social science over the years is that for the most part, an aggregation of forecasts performs better over the long term than a single forecast does. And so, I set out to see what kind of information you could glean from aggregating mock drafts. And so this is a project I've been working on for the past couple of years. And I think it's been a really fun project, a really fruitful project, also pretty time intensive. But it's been very gratifying. Originally when I was doing projects in college and grad school, I would occasionally sneak a sports topic in every now and then, but I didn't view it as something that I thought was something that I could do with a career at all. And that's not at all what I do in my day job as a data analyst, or data scientist or what have you. This has been a fun project on the side to kind of, a lot of people, when they say, how do you get into sports analytics? They say, find a project that you're really interested in. So this is my project that I've been interested in. And so it takes up a lot of my time, like I said, but it's a labor of love. And on draft night, it's always fun everyone's trying to follow along and see what's going on. And I've kind of been following it for the whole year. So once the draft ends, I take a little bit of a break, and then you dive right back into the next year's draft. And it's a long process, and a lot of things change over time. So it's fun to follow along.
Okay, so let's talk about that a bit more. So I guess for listeners who are new to the way the NFL sets itself up online, so what is a mock draft? So people just do, how many picks do they try to predict?
So yeah, a mock draft is basically a prediction, a forecast. It kind of depends on what kind of mock draft you do, but generally most mock drafts try to predict the first round of the NFL draft. So the draft is part of the NFL's kind of competitive balance process. And so basically, the team with the worst record at the end of the regular season gets to pick first in the draft. So basically, the draft is for, I'm from Cincinnati originally. The Cincinnati Bengals football team had many years of futility. So, a lot of times, at least in my childhood, the Bengals were one of the worst teams of the 1990s. They would be picking in the draft. The draft is this idea, I think that there's some hope at the end of the tunnel, that if you get lucky, and that's what I've learned more over the years, but if you pick well, the draft is a way that you can set up your team for years to come. So most mock drafts are just the first round, so the first 32 selections. So that's where most people are spending their time. That's the TV ratings for the draft get a lot of cluster on the first night of the draft. And this last year was the first night that it was actually aired in prime time on a major TV network. In the past, it was, mostly the cable networks. And this past year, ABC aired the first night of the draft in prime time, which was a big deal. But yeah, mock drafts are, mostly people trying to say, this is what I think this team will do. And the mock draft is kind of a marriage of sorts between the team making the selection and so their needs, or their, more like their kind of idea of what the needs are, and then perception of player value. And that's normally done by how you rank players. And then that's the mock draft is sort of a marriage of that piece of the need and of the idea of how good or how, maybe how valuable a player is. So they're fun to track, and a lot of people view them in a negative way. Michael Lombardi, who was a former, NFL front office executive, said that, in the past, teams would want this information. They want to know who the really smart people who follow the league and cover the draft, they want to know where they think players are going. And so teams in the past have used this type of data to say, when do we expect this player who we're interested to go off the board? Do we want to trade up in the draft potentially? And there's a lot of research that says that trading up in the draft can sometimes be, fraught with complication because of people's kind of over perception of how good they are at evaluating talent. Or, can we get the same player that we're really interested in, that we think is valuable, at a lower selection? And so, some of the ideas that, you think around this concept, I come back to fantasy football. So fantasy football, everyone has, an idea of, where players are ranked. So in a fantasy football draft, you get a ranking, the Yahoo rankings or ESPN rankings or whatever aggregation that you choose, whether it's yours or others. And then you have what they always give you a metric of average draft position. So in their mock drafts that, millions of people are doing, so they get millions of draws probably of selections, they can say, hey, in the millions of mock drafts we did, or even just actual drafts, this is where player X on average went. On one side, there's this evaluation perspective of which player is the best, and that's not what I'm trying to do. That's a really complicated problem, and in some ways, you're always going to just have an estimate. But the actual draft selection is a very cut and dry thing. The draft happens, and we know exactly where the player went. So we know how NFL teams in this environment valued that player. And so we can use this mock draft data to get a sense of what a range of the player's, what I call expected draft position is. And that gives us a sense of, hey, where do we think they're going to go in the draft? Maybe what do we need to do, to get that guy? But just because, just like in a fantasy football draft, if you have a player that you pick above expectation or below expectation, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because you can draft players above expectation that perform well, and you can draft players below expectation that perform well. But the idea is that you want to, maximize the efficiency of your limited resources. And so that's why I think this information is valuable. And to me, it gives an evidence base for the draft. And the draft is highly dominated by, individual feelings. and their kind of opinionated evaluation of players. And that's why I call this project Grinding the Mocks, because people who evaluate, kind of try to get the sense of where a draft player is going to get drafted, will often look at his film, his college film. And when they watch players, they call it grinding the tape. So I'm not grinding the tape. I don't pretend to be a football expert. I'm as much of a layperson as the next guy, but I'm an analytical guy. I'm an inquisitive person. I'm a problem solver. And so when I saw this, I said, I think there's something to be had in these mock drafts. And so, I scrape mock drafts. I use R quite a lot. So I'll go and scrape mock drafts all over the internet and bring them together and run my player level models and aggregate and adjust. And that's how I end up getting the kind of expected draft position for a player. So I grind mocks. I don't grind the tape. I don't really know what I'm looking at when I look at the tape. That's not my area of specialty.
Cool. Okay. So all this work has resulted in like a shiny dashboard that anyone can go and use. So are you able to talk us a bit through about that process? So how you went from, just sitting at home watching the draft with mates to having this fully functional sort of dashboard that anyone can sort of use?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as an R programmer, Shiny is the R programming language's, web development framework. So it allows you to take the content that you've built in R. So it can be, tables or ggplot2 graphs, or I use a lot of Plotly interactive visualizations. It allows you to take that and structure it and create a data product experience, basically. So, the data itself is valuable, right? It helps you get a sense of what's going on, but the visualization and the interactivity aspect I thought would be really great for me and then for other people. So for me, I'd like a reproducible way to get a graph about where a player's mock draft stock is going. And so, I have a section of the Shiny application under the pre-draft process called draft stock charts. And that's because I was making those charts all the time. And I said, well, if I could just go to this application and just click on a player and hit the submit button and get a chart, that saves time for me, but also it creates this fun discovery experience. So I had a little bit of experience making Shiny applications before with some other stuff that I had done in some of my work. And so I'm always learning new things. And Shiny, I'm not a JavaScript expert, so sometimes I feel like I'm pushing myself and Shiny to, a certain level, but that's what I do. So as an R programmer, it's really great to have Shiny as a way to communicate results, because as a lot of your guests in the past have brought up, and I'll echo it again, communication is really important. And so to me, I want to be able to communicate with others. Hey, when I say that, this player, so for example, let's take Joe Burrow, who's the likely number one pick in the draft by the Cincinnati Bengals. At the beginning of the year, people were saying, he came out of nowhere. And I can say, yeah, we don't exactly know where his draft stock was. And so oftentimes you'll hear people say, this guy had a 4th round draft stock. And so to me, it's helpful to understand where people start. And so, for me, Joe Burrow, when he first comes into my data, he comes in as like a 4th or 5th round player, I think. And then you see this shot up the boards. It's the second year in a row where we've had a player kind of come, quote unquote, from nowhere in terms of the data. But out on the field, people are watching, and the season, things are changing. And so, with this data, we can see that happen. We get a sense of, an estimate. People say that, all models are wrong, but, some are helpful or something like that. I think this is a helpful model. I'm not saying this is the exact, he started off in the 4th round and now he's the top guy. I'm saying that he started off somewhere. And obviously I'm interested in change over time. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I want to predict what's going to happen on draft night. So while it's cool that he started from, the 4th round or the 5th round or what have you, it's more important to me at the end of the day that we have an estimate that's, at least accurate to a certain extent about what's going to happen on draft night. And one of the problems we have in this world is that you want to make out-of-sample predictions with your data. But I don't have a lot of data on this. I've really this is my 3rd draft doing this project. And so I really can't dig deep into the well of past drafts to find, training data so that I can make these out-of-sample predictions. So I'm really only making out-of-sample predictions once every year. And so you want to try to balance having this journey of the data, but then also be able to have some amount of predictive power. So it's a fun project, and there's a lot of things I'm looking forward to doing more with it in terms of, writing, but it's a living and breathing project, and Shiny allows me to serve what I'm working on and really have a nice front end to access what I'm doing in the back end for hopefully everyone to enjoy. And so it's at grindingthemocks.com. So and that redirects to the Shiny application, and it's also linked on my Twitter. So yeah.
Okay. So how would you want people to use it? So let's say I'm on the website now and I just want to know how a player's done. So how would you recommend that I use your dashboard and explore this player?
So when you land on the site, there's kind of three main options on the top, and you would go to pre-draft process. There's a little arrow button. You click down on that, and you can go to draft stock charts. And from there, you can go to there's a filter for draft year and player name. And so you can, go from draft year to draft year, and you can kind of do some searching for players. So for example, the default player that shows is Joe Burrow. So you don't have to search for Joe Burrow. But if you wanted to search for, for example, I'm an alum of the University of Pittsburgh, and we have a player in the draft process this year named Dane Jackson. So I would click on Joe Burrow, I would click delete, and I could search Dane, and it would pop up, and I would select Dane, and I'd hit submit under submit selections, and there you can see his draft stock chart pop up, and you can see, little dots for the individual mock draft. And so if you highlight a mock draft, it'll show you who the person making the mock draft was, when they made the mock draft, how I categorized them as either an expert, a member of the media, or a fan. And then you can see where they actually mocked the player, what their mock draft pick was. And then you can follow along with the smoother, and that shows kind of the lowest estimate of their line of best fit in the data. And you can see the confidence intervals as well. And so for Dane Jackson, we can see that the confidence intervals tend to be pretty large because he doesn't have a lot of mock drafts. He's probably a later round prospect. A good player. I'm biased because he went to my college, but he's going to be a later selection in the mock draft, in the actual draft, and in mock drafts in general. So a lot of focus on the first round, but there's a lot of data out there, and so we can get some insights on players that don't get mocked in the first draft and in the first round of the draft. And to be honest, the draft is 250 some picks long, and we tend to focus most of our time on the first round, and that's for good reason. Those players tend to succeed a lot at much higher rates. But to be honest, the NFL is a quantity game too, and so a lot of these players are going to make rosters, and the majority of rosters are not made up of first round players. They're made up of players picked in the second, third, fourth, and fifth rounds, or something like that. So these other players are going to be roster fillers, and they can be role players, and you can also find valuable additions to your team in later rounds, even though the first round is what gets the most attention. And so there's a lot of fun elements on the site. So we take these expected draft positions and then we end up ranking them. So you can look at the mock draft rankings. Something also that's pretty fun is I have this section called Team Mock Draft Profiles. And you can go in there and search by team. This year's draft is the first year that I've begun collecting which team was making the pick. So you can see, for example, your favorite team, and you can look and see, hey, I'm a fan of the Cincinnati Bengals. They better take a quarterback number one overall, and we see that in the data that to a huge extent, quarterback is the position of choice. And you can see, over time a little bit, when did suddenly quarterback become the number one pick, or which players? So Joe Burrow gets mocked to the Bengals a lot. When did that start happening? And you can see some of the other players that people thought were going to be options for the Bengals. So that's the pre-draft process. And then in draft night, there's a section I have called draft night. You can do kind of player comparisons. So that means you can take players from any of the different drafts and put them on the same chart. And so you can see, standardize it based on how many days from the draft, so that we're all on the same x-axis. And then you can see kind of, Joe Burrow, how does he compare to last year's number one overall pick, Kyler Murray, who kind of also seemingly came out of nowhere. They thought he was going to play baseball professionally. So, what does that look like? And so, that's a fun section of the site to work on as well. And then my last thing that I've worked on so far is a section called Player Surplus Value. And that's just basically, we're going to look at how what was expected in the draft and then what happened in the draft. And we can kind of see, where players fall relative to expectation. And you can kind of highlight the team you're interested in and some of the metrics you're interested in using and get a sense of, which teams tend to pick more players above expectation, which teams tend to pick players below expectation, which were the kind of biggest value picks, so to speak, which were the least valuable picks, so to speak. So there's a lot of stuff on there, and I'm still building some of it out. Like I said, it's a kind of a one-man operation, and most of the time I try to spend collecting data and then also doing some writing. So that's the main sense of the site and all the things you can do on it.
Cool. Okay, so with regards to, I guess, building the whole Shiny app, usually, obviously, you're going to do some sanity checks on the data and, who did what sort of mock draft. As you were doing this, was there something that surprised you with regards to, who was putting out what sort of mock draft?
Yeah, sure. So, I take this from a kind of agnostic perspectives. Some people, they really only look at experts, or maybe you only look at, the journalist that really covers the team that is making the selection. And so I come in from a point where I'm not going to assume that I know anything. So in my first year of doing this, I assumed, basically that every mock draft was created equal, so to speak. But then with an extra year of data, you have some way of looking at accuracy. And so, one thing that I was interested in was in my categorization of the mock drafts, you want to see, which of the areas the experts, the media members or fans tend to, do better in their predictions. And it turns out that the experts are experts for a reason. The experts do have, overall on the whole, better accuracy. And there are some places, and I'm not going to name any names, but that people kind of tend to deride and tend, a little bit for their mock drafts, and at least because they do a lot of them throughout the process and they're usually out there pretty early. But some of those mock drafts actually tend to be pretty accurate at the end of the day for the first round and for some of the other rounds. So to me, it was interesting to kind of see confirmation that the experts are actually in some ways better at making these predictions overall, which you would hope to see. The media tends to follow a little bit as well. There are some national media members actually who write for kind of prominent publications who actually do a pretty good job. They tend to get the draft pretty right, and the fans tend to fall behind a little bit. And I think that there's an interesting theory of information, kind of how it perpetuates through this network, that I think it's kind of interesting. I tend to think that the fans tend to follow expert opinion. So I'll give you an example of a couple players in this year's draft. So one is a guy named Patrick Queen, who's a linebacker from LSU, Louisiana State University, and they just won the national championship. And he really balled out in the college football playoffs against Oklahoma. Everyone was like, wow, this guy Patrick Queen's so great. And then, the Clemson game, he played really well too. And then suddenly, within the next couple of weeks, suddenly he's getting in tons of mock drafts, and he hadn't been in really any mock drafts the whole year. And so that's because experts were saying, whoa, I missed out on this guy. I need to go back and watch more game tape of him. And then suddenly when you see that and you see prominent kind of people in the NFL scouting community or this public, draft community start to putting him in mock drafts in the first and second round, and suddenly his draft stock chart just kind of pogos up. And similarly, there was a player for Louisville named Mekhi Becton, who I have his draft stock curve is like a loop-de-loop. In the beginning of the process, people were saying, yeah, I think late first round pick, big fellow, 6'8", 300, whatever pounds. And then, throughout the year, people kind of softened on him as some of the other players, had good seasons. And then at the end of the year, suddenly you see some prominent folks say, actually, I think he's a top 10 pick. And he hadn't even been a top 10 pick in the beginning. And so suddenly you see, his stock kind of hit a valley, and then suddenly, it's rising up again. So, it's really interesting to see how this theory of information works and how the insights spread and how people kind of look to these thought leaders in the field, whether it be people who work for the NFL Network like Daniel Jeremiah, or people like Matt Miller from Bleacher Report, who tend to have pretty decent mock drafts overall. But it's interesting to kind of see some of the people out there and you say, oh, well, I don't really view his opinion as being very predictive. And then at the end of the day, when we look at actual results, they tend to perform pretty decently. And so, yeah, it's a fun project. It's cool to look at all the visuals and see players and compare players. And, this is just my contribution to the broader community, the draft Twitter community, as people call it. They love to have their takes. And so their takes are often rooted in opinion. And, it's not like Pro Football Focus, where they look at every play of every game and they grade it. Oftentimes, scouts, or people who call themselves scouts, are watching maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 games of a player and then making an opinion. And so to me, is that representative of the player? Are you watching the right games? Are you watching the right snaps? So to me, what I'm doing, at least, I feel like I'm getting a broad sampling of folks and their opinions. And ideally, let's say that I get a player and one guy mocks him a certain way and another guy puts him in a mock draft, or another person puts them in a mock draft in a certain spot. Maybe they've watched some games and another person has watched some games. Some way I'm getting kind of the accumulation of opinions, and hopefully in my world I'm getting lots of different opinions who have seen maybe on the whole all of his snaps in a year or over a couple years. So those are some fun things that I've learned while researching this project and while building some of the parts of the data product of the Grinding the Mocks site. So fun project, and there's a lot of questions to ask still. And so I feel like there's a lot of methods that we can use and a lot of questions we can ask. And so, my plan is to do some more of that during this process around some kind of key areas. So, I wrote a blog post about the Alabama football quarterback Tua Tagovailoa and how his injury affected his draft stock in mock drafts. And I'm going to do some similar work around the Senior Bowl, which is the premier college football all-star game for seniors. And then something similar around the NFL scouting combine, which is where players do athletic testing to look at the impact of athletic testing on draft stock in mock drafts. So there's a lot of stuff to explore beyond just, the end of the day on draft night, what happens. There's a lot of really interesting ways to slice and dice and look at this information and ask some really cool questions.
Cool. So your work has been featured on 538 and Wharton Moneyball. Are you able to talk us through how they used Grinding the Mocks for their insights?
Sure. So both of those experiences come through Josh Hermsmeyer, who writes about football and particularly about the NFL for 538. So Josh is a really fun follow on Twitter, and I think he's been a guest on your podcast. And so, Josh loves to josh people, so to speak. And, he was saying something about the draft and probably something about a certain player. And, I replied to him and I said, hey, by the way, I'm collecting mock drafts and this is what the mock drafts have to say about this player. And, he reached out to me and I reached out to him and I said, hey, I think this would be a really cool, a source of data for a 538 piece. And he said, I think so too. And so, what he ended up doing was using my data and taking kind of probably a slice of data from a month before the draft, leading up to the draft, and looking at some kind of basic, like I said, fantasy football metrics around average draft position, and looked at kind of what the first round projected, and looked at some of the players from the 2019 draft class. So he looked at 2 tight ends from the University of Iowa, TJ Hawkinson and Noah Fant, and looked at how their draft stocks fared throughout the draft process. And he looked at a couple of wide receivers who had 2 very strong years from the University of Mississippi, A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf. And A.J. Brown was drafted in the second round by the Tennessee Titans, and DK Metcalf was drafted in the second round by the Seattle Seahawks, and Hawkinson and Fant were drafted in the first round by the Lions and the Broncos, respectively. And looked at them and said, hey, these players are similar players. They at least play on the same team. What's going on in their process, and what does that say about what we think will happen on the night of the draft? Which positions tend to have the largest kind of rise, so to speak, in their average draft position over time, and that tends to be the quarterback. And, in a retrospective basis, I did a poster for the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Conference this past year, and I had a little chart that said, based on the mean squared error for positions, quarterbacks tend to be the ones that are most over projected. And so those are the ones that tend to fly up the draft board, so to speak, leading up to the draft. And then Josh did a follow-up piece for 538 the day after to say, what happened in the first round. Obviously, the first round is only 32 picks. So, one domino falls in a way that, you don't expect. And suddenly everything is shot and, trades happen in areas where potentially it was unexpected. And that can kind of shake up what's going on in the draft. But that's also what makes the draft so fun. But ultimately, and, Josh was a guest on Wharton Moneyball and was talking about this article. And, Cade Massey, who's one of the hosts of Wharton Moneyball, has written a lot about in his research about the draft. And so it was interesting, to hear how they looked at my data and how I was thinking about what I was doing. And Cade is a really smart guy and someone whose opinion I value really highly. But yeah, ultimately, it's all Josh Hermsmeyer. So Josh is listening to this. I want to say thank you for promoting my work and featuring my work. And hopefully we'll be able to do, potentially some more of that this year, but maybe hopefully we'll see. And maybe in a deeper way than just what we did this past year. But, I'll take whatever I can get and continue to do the work that I do.
Yeah, very, very cool. So you mentioned that you have some ideas for the future. So now that this data is available, what do you think are the really interesting sort of next questions that, fans and clubs can start using this mock draft data to start answering?
So one of the techniques I think would lend itself really well to this, and I know it's popping up everywhere, are Bayesian methods. So Bayesian methods and hierarchical modeling I think are really valuable, add a lot of value to this data because right now, and then you kind of pair that with simulation-based methods basically. So right now we don't necessarily have a sense of for each player, or I don't have a sense right now for something I'm working on, and in my spare time, I'm working on is. Can we get a distribution of probabilities for where a player might get selected? And so, teams, they have a lot of different processes for how they develop their draft board. So they develop them and they have analytical processes potentially involved. They have scouting processes involved. They have the coaching staff involved in saying, these are how we rank the players in terms of players who we think would fit what our team is doing and who we think would be good to have on our team. So they have that piece. And then eventually, if we have this distribution of picks and the idea of probability, we can have a much more rich discussion of when we're around to pick at the next selection, what's our risk tolerance? We think that maybe there's a 50% chance, for example, that this player will be available at the next spot. What's our risk tolerance for that? Or, hey, we think this player is going to be available a 75% chance in 50 picks. Let's try to trade down and maybe get some more draft picks, which we know is a great way to try to build your roster with multiple shots in the draft to find quality players. So to me, right now, what I'm showing publicly is just, the raw estimates and a little bit of a confidence interval, but it's not truly a probabilistic way of saying for this player, what do we think is his distribution of probabilities in terms of where he's going to get picked? So for me, this is not going to replace player evaluation, but I think this marries quite well with this player evaluation and this draft evaluation piece that a lot of teams, in some ways do very well and some teams don't. And you can see that because of the research that Cade Massey has done about teams that trade up. And teams that trade up tend to be overconfident in the production of that player. And so a lot of the times when teams trade up they think they're getting the player they want, and sometimes it works out, but on the whole, it doesn't necessarily end up being a positive thing for your team. So, ultimately, this is a decision aid. It's a tool that will help you understand what is the probability, what is the likelihood of this happening in the draft, and kind of help guide your decision making in terms of, are we cool with sitting where we are? Do we want to explore options to move up, or do we think we can even trade down? And so I know teams are building some of their own models. And so I think that this is kind of falls into that category of, hey, like teams are actually already using these and have in some ways, used them for a long time. But with the advent of the internet and with web scraping, we can really blow up the sample size and some of the methods that we have to get what we hope are more accurate estimates of a prospect's expected draft position.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining me today on Chilling with Charlie. I had a lot of fun, and I think the listeners will have even more fun after using your sort of Guiding the Mocks Shiny app. So once again, how do they get to it?
So it's grindingthemocks.com, and it redirects to the Shiny application. And if you find me on Twitter, my Twitter username is Benj_Robinson, so BENJ_Robinson, and it's the link in my bio. So you can find it there, and definitely feel free to reach out with any questions or whatnot. I love to engage with folks, and I'm often kind of lurking in the background, and I can shoot off charts at people, but I love when people kind of go into the app and explore and find their own insights there. So I love that.